Hi everybody, so here I am to introduce you a lesson on the Bronte sisters. As you can see here we have three names, Charlotte, Emily and Anne, but actually the sisters were more than three, were five. But Charlotte, Emily and Anne happened to be the most famous of the three sisters, and we will see why. So let's get started, and here you are. We have a portrait, which I suppose is National Portrait Gallery in London. This is the portrait, and the only one we have, actually, the original one of the three sisters. On the left side, you have their names, Charlotte, who was born in 1816 and died in 1855 at the age of 38. Emily, who died at the age of 30, and Anne, the youngest of the sisters, who died at the age of 29. So as you can see, they all died at quite a young age, and they all lived between two different periods, historical periods, between the Regency period, where we had already met Jane Austen, and the Victorian period. They are just in between. Let's move on. Oh, so this young man that you can see here on the right was Mr. Bronte, their father. Well, actually, it was not his real name. He was an Irish man who lived a very long life, and he was the father of these young ladies. He came from Ireland and was the so-called perfect self-made Irishman. He was an Anglican clergyman. He had studied. He was not very, very rich, but because he was so intelligent, clever, a brilliant man, and also because he was a very lucky man, at least when he was very young, he could move to England, and he went to study at Cambridge University, where he graduated. He became a priest, an Anglican priest. And after some years, when he was in England, he decided to change his surname from Bronte into Bronte. Why this and why this name? Well, he changed this name because Bronte was typically Irish, and already at that time Irish people were not very welcomed in England, because there had already been lots of problems between England and Ireland, and so Irish people were not seen under a good light, let's say so. And so he changed his surname to make it more elegant and less Irish. Why did he choose Bronte? Maybe there have been some ideas, but maybe he chose Bronte because Bronte was the title. Of course, Bronte is a city in Sicily, we know, no? Pistacchio di Bronte. But also, this happened to be one of the titles of an English hero, Lord Nelson. And we know that Mr. Bronte admired Lord Nelson very much. And so maybe because of this, and also because the Bronte reminded in some way the original surname, he chose this one. The three sisters, Charlotte, Emily and Anne, were all born in Thornton, which is quite a nice place in England's countryside, only 11 kilometers south of London. But then all the family moved in Yorkshire because Mr. Bronte was given a parish, he was a priest, and they went to live in Haworth, Yorkshire, which is in the northern part of England, and it was very close to the Pennine Moors. The Pennines are hills which are in England, in the northern part of England. It is quite a beautiful and wild place, and so these young ladies grew up in this house that you can see here in the parsonage. Parsonage is the name that in English they gave to the house where the priest lived, and which is usually close to the church. So they all grew here, in between the wild nature, the one landscape of the moors, and the industrialized part of England, because Yorkshire was full of industrial towns, and actually it was the heart of industrial revolution. As a matter of fact, Haworth was not very far from Keighley, which was one of the most important industrial towns in England at that time. But the family, well, if we have said that Mr. Bronte was very lucky when he was young, he seems to have lost all of his luck when he grew up. He fell in love with his wife, Maria Bramwell, who became Mrs. Bronte, and they had 6 daughters, well, actually 5 daughters and just 1 son. But all of the family, apart from Mr. Bronte, died at a very young age. So actually Mr. Bronte remained alone, because he lived a very long life, dying at the age of 84. As you can see here from this information, Maria Bramwell, that you can see in the biggest photo, was worn out by 6 pregnancies and also suffered of a uterine cancer, and she died in her mid-30s, so she left his husband alone to grow up all their sons. The 2 oldest daughters that you cannot see here in these pictures because they were very young when they died, so they didn't have any portrait done, died when they were 10 and 11 years old, and we will see why they died. The other sons and daughters, as you can see here in this picture, where you can see Bramwell, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, they all died when they were younger than 40 years old, and we will see the reasons why they died. But what I can already tell you is the only son, Bramwell, died because he took to drink and drugs. He was the only hope for the family to carry on with the surname of the Bronte, but actually he died when he was just 31 years old, and it was a tragedy. So Mr. Bronte survived all of the other members of his family. Imagine how sad it had been for him. And he died at the age of 84. Here you can see some pictures of Haworth, the place in which the Bronte sisters grew up and lived quite all of their life. You can see the parsonage, the back part of their house. You can see the church where Mr. Bronte worked as a priest, and also a room of the parsonage, which is now a museum dedicated, of course, to the Bronte sisters. So if you go to Haworth, you can visit it. And this was all the world that the Bronte sisters knew about. As you can remember, Jane Austen just lived in her little tiny world in the English countryside, where more or less it was the same for the Bronte sisters, with a couple of exceptions. But actually quite all of their lives were lived here in this place. And this is also reflected, for example, in one of the most important novels, the one written by Emily Bronte, which is Wuthering Heights, in which the action takes place in a place which is not very far from Haworth. They got a very good education, but they didn't have this education at school. They were sent, to a school, but they remained there for just a very short time. They were mostly self-educated at home because the school experience proved disastrous. And this was not the first time that it was a disastrous experience in the Bronte family. In fact, the first 2 daughters, do you remember? The ones whose pictures we don't have, they both died at a school, the Cowan Bridge School, which was a very good school, but the living conditions were usually very, very difficult for girls. And so they died because of TBC, of course, when they were just 10 and 11 years old. And Charlotte immortalized the harshness, the very difficult living conditions of these kinds of schools in Jane Eyre, in which we can see a school like this, which is depicted quite harshly, quite vengefully by Charlotte. Then, after having had their education, they started working, and they immediately began writing poems at the beginning. And they actually published one book of poems, but it just sold 2 or 3 copies that, of course, were sold to their relatives. As for their private lives, Emily and Dan never got married. Charlotte got married, but it was a very short marriage, and we will see why. The 3 sisters dedicated themselves to writing, of course, but also to schooling, because they also began to work as governesses, that is to say, as teachers, because they had a good education. Then, apart from their tiny little world, there was an experience, a very strange experience actually, because Emily and Charlotte in 1842 went to Brussels, yes, Brussels in Belgium, where they got some education and worked as a student teacher. But Emily soon felt homesick and went back to Yorkshire, while Charlotte stayed there and fell in love with this man that you can see here in this portrait, who was the principal of the school and whose name was Constantin Heger. But it was a very unlucky love, because the man didn't love Charlotte and was already married. So the story had an unhappy ending, but offered some parts, some hints, some suggestions and ideas for Charlotte's future novels. In 1844, we found again all the 3 sisters reunited in Yorkshire, where they devoted themselves to writing. And then we arrive in the year 1847, which is the golden year for the 3 sisters, because in this same year, all the most important novels written by them were published. Jane Eyre by Charlotte, Agnes by Anne, and Wuthering Heights by Emily. But as you can see on these covers of the first version of the books, you can see that we can't read their real names on these pages, because actually all of the 3 novels were published not anonymously, like Jane Austen did, but using male pseudonyms. Charlotte as Cover Bell, Anne as Acton Bell, and Emily as Alice Bell. As you can see, they kept their initials for the pseudonyms. These books were not immediately successful. They became very successful and very popular among readers only after the death of the 3 sisters. How unlucky. And then we come to the end. 1848, just 1 year after the publication of their novels, Emily dies of TBC. Anne followed her in 1849, 1 year after. Charlotte resisted some years more because she died in 1855. She had just married and was pregnant, but as I told you before, her marriage was very short because she died because of the complications of pregnancy. So she didn't give life to her son or daughter, we don't know, and also she died because of some complications. It was a very hard job to be a woman at that time. You could not publish a book. It was very difficult to give birth to a child. So, girls, we are happy and we are lucky to live in our century. So this is all for now about the Brontes' lives, and see you later for another lesson, maybe about their works. Bye-bye.